Sometimes it's not the truth we fear, but the silence wrapped around it. In quiet towns, old grief lingers like mist on the river, and the smallest things, a folded swan, a missing name, can reopen wounds thought long forgotten. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. Jessica Fletcher stepped off the train with her usual calm poise, her suitcase in one hand and a wool scarf knotted neatly at her throat. The small platform at Halcyon Hill Station was just as she remembered, quaint, ivy-laced, and lightly dusted with the golden hush of autumn. But as the breeze stirred the branches and carried the scent of aging leaves, she sensed something else in the air, something quieter but heavier. Not grief exactly, more like a town holding its breath. She had been invited to speak at the 40th anniversary of the Whitmore Library, a place dear to her once her writing retreat before Cabot Cove took permanent residence in her heart. Halcyon Hill was the sort of town that kept its manners pressed and folded, even when its heart was broken. A few familiar faces greeted her with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Mrs. Ferrell, the baker's widow, asked if Jessica remembered the apple turnovers. Young Ben Salter, now older and somehow thinner, offered to carry her bag. Jessica accepted both the kindness and the wariness they seemed to conceal. As she walked through the tree-lined streets toward the inn, where she would not, as it turned out, be staying, Jessica noticed the shuttered storefronts. Not abandoned, just dormant. Like the town itself had curled inward. And then there was the way people paused just a second too long when she mentioned the Whitmore estate. A flicker of something unspoken passed between them. Grief's twin cousin, perhaps. Discomfort. She had come to celebrate stories, but it was clear that Halcyon Hill had one of its own. One it hadn't finished telling. The estate sat atop a gentle rise just outside the village. A stone house, dignified but tired, its gables softened by moss and time. Jessica had admired it in her youth, when Elspeth Whitmore still hosted garden teas and chamber music recitals. Those days seemed distant now, as though they belonged to another century. It was Gavin Whitmore, Elspeth's grandson, who met her at the iron gate. Tall and thin, with silvered temples and a bow tie that looked more like habit than flourish, Gavin offered a reserved but courteous welcome. "I do hope you'll be comfortable here, Jessica," he said, gesturing toward the estate. "My grandmother was quite touched that you accepted the library's invitation." Jessica's curiosity stirred. Gavin's voice was polite, practiced, but his eyes held the strain of someone maintaining a fragile order. The house itself was dimly lit, its silence almost ecclesiastical. A place that had once held music now held memories. Elspeth was not present to greet her. "Resting," Gavin explained. And when Jessica asked after the rest of the family, he hesitated. "It's only myself and our nurse, Estelle Brandt. My sister Moira lives in the city now." Jessica noted the absence, like one might note the silence after a name left off a dedication page. As she settled into the guest room overlooking the hedged courtyard, Jessica found herself glancing at the wallpaper, the furnishings, the faded photo on the desk. The Whitmore home had the feel of a chapter closed mid-sentence. The next morning brought a soft rain and a stronger craving for coffee than conversation. Jessica stepped into the Halcyon Diner, a narrow teal and chrome holdover from the 1950s, where she was met with the warm clang of a bell and the hesitant smile of Maisie, the waitress she remembered from a previous visit. "You're here for the library thing," Maisie said, pouring coffee with practiced hands. "Thought I recognized you." Jessica nodded, grateful for the warmth of the mug in her hands. "Yes, though it's turning out to be more of a return than I expected." Maisie leaned in, lowering her voice. "Staying at the Whitmore place?" Jessica gave a small smile. "I am." Maisie hesitated, then said quietly, "They never did get over what happened to Sylvie." Jessica looked up, eyebrows gently lifted. "Sylvie?" Maisie glanced around as if the walls themselves might overhear. "Elspeth's daughter. Drowned years ago. Riverbank. They said it was an accident, but—" Her voice trailed off. "There were stories." The waitress returned to her duties before Jessica could ask more, but the mention of a woman gone too soon lingered with her. Sylvie. The name had not appeared in the brief family introductions Gavin offered, nor in the photographs at the estate. A gap in the narrative, one not openly mourned, but not forgotten either. Jessica sipped her coffee slowly, watching the raindrops race down the diner window. It seemed that the town's silence had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with unfinished sorrow. Back at the estate, the rain had slowed, but the stillness remained. Jessica took to exploring the house with quiet steps, her curiosity piqued by the patterns of its silences. Doors that should have been open were locked. Corridors seemed freshly dusted, yet smelled faintly of age and abandonment. On the second floor, a hallway curved toward what appeared to be an unused wing. A small table there held a cracked vase filled with artificial gardenias, each petal slightly yellowed, the scent a memory rather than a presence. Estelle Brandt, the nurse, intercepted Jessica near the staircase. "Can I help you find something, Mrs. Fletcher?" Jessica smiled politely. "No, thank you. I'm simply reacquainting myself with the house." Estelle nodded, but her fingers tightened slightly around the notebook she carried. "We try to keep the west wing closed, for privacy." Jessica inclined her head, filing away the evasiveness. Later, over tea in the conservatory, she tried gently to draw Gavin into conversation about the family's past. "Your Aunt Sylvie," Jessica began casually. Maisie at the diner mentioned her. Gavin looked momentarily startled, then composed himself. "Sylvie passed some years ago. A drowning. Very tragic, but the matter was laid to rest." Jessica heard what wasn't said. The pause before drowning, the hesitation before rest. She didn't press further, but her thoughts were already sorting themselves into quiet columns. That evening, the wind stirred the curtains in her guest room, and Jessica stood by the window watching the old garden sway in the dark. Somewhere behind those hedges, a story lay buried, and in this house, buried things had a way of shaping the air. The next day brought Jessica to the library. She was early for her panel talk and had asked the curator, a mild-mannered man named Donald Bain, for access to the archives. "You're welcome to look," he said, unlocking the door to a small back room that smelled of dust and newsprint. The Whitmore family donated quite a lot in the 70s, old programs, letters, that sort of thing. Jessica browsed gently, careful not to disturb the fragile order of things. In a collection of recital programs tied with fading ribbon, she noticed a curious detail. Sylvie Whitmore's name appeared frequently as a pianist, recitals at the estate, a lover of Chopin. There was even a photograph, Sylvie seated at a grand piano, smiling. The caption read simply, "Evening in D minor, 1983. Then, as she leafed through a stack of music journals, a thin folded object slipped out and fell softly to the floor. It was a paper swan, folded from a page, torn from a foreign language music review. The creases were delicate, but confident, as though made by habit. It had been tucked into the spine of a book, almost ceremoniously hidden. Jessica bent to pick it up. There was no dust on it. It hadn't been there for decades. Someone had placed it recently. The coincidence was too exact. She studied it, fingertips brushing the paper's worn edges. The fold was intentional, almost tender. Not just a keepsake, perhaps a message. Jessica's breath slowed. She looked around the archive room, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. A single swan, folded in silence, had fallen from memory into the present. And someone wanted it to be found. The Whitmore Library Gala unfolded in a warm haze of candlelight, polished wood, and polite applause. Jessica stood near the refreshments table, a modest glass of sparkling cider in hand, as the small orchestra tucked into a corner played a genteel waltz. The event had all the hallmarks of tradition, bookplates, speeches, and gentle nostalgia. Jessica's attention, however, drifted to the man standing at the podium. Gavin Whitmore, crisp in a dark suit and silver cufflinks, raised his glass with the composure of someone long accustomed to saying the right thing. His words were eloquent, drawing on Whitmore history and the written word, celebrating the role of literature in carrying memory across generations. And yet, something about him struck Jessica as rehearsed. Not insincere exactly, but distant, like an actor, too practiced in his role. When he spoke of legacy, his voice faltered just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Jessica caught it. His fingers brushed his jacket pocket, and his gaze, for the briefest second, drifted beyond the guests to the tall windows behind them, toward the grounds, toward the greenhouse. Later, when the audience clapped politely and returned to mingling, Gavin disappeared. Not rudely, he simply faded away, leaving the room with no more resistance than a page turned in a drafty room. Jessica stayed a while longer, speaking with the head librarian and a retired judge who remembered Sylvie Whitmore's recitals. But Gavin's absence tugged at her mind. People don't drift from celebrations without reason. She glanced at the tall windows where the glass reflected only candlelight and memory. Somewhere outside, something had pulled him away from the story he was so determined to tell. The night deepened. Jessica had just returned to her guest room when she heard it, a faint knock, hesitant. Estelle Brandt, pale beneath the yellow glow of the corridor lamp, stood in the doorway. "There's been an accident," she said softly. The greenhouse stood a little ways behind the estate, part of Sylvie's legacy, Jessica recalled. Lantern light flickered inside as Gavin's body lay slumped amidst broken terracotta pots and overturned planters. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and gardenia, far too strong, almost perfumed. Sheriff Mason, a familiar if older face from Jessica's previous visit to Halcyon Hill, arrived shortly after. A slow-moving man with a cautious manner, he surveyed the scene with tired eyes. "Looks like a fall," he muttered, crouching beside the body. "Slipped, maybe. Or fainted. Could have been the wine from the gala." Jessica stayed quiet, stepping lightly through the edge of the greenhouse. A nearby table bore an open bottle of brandy, one glass half full. A careless stumble wouldn't have surprised her, if not for the unnatural stillness of the scene. The terracotta shards formed a crescent, broken but not scattered. The nearby watering can sat upright. One of the pots, shattered in 3 clean pieces, seemed to have been placed carefully back on the bench, as if someone had tried to erase chaos. Jessica knelt slowly, eyes drawn to Gavin's wrist. A scrape, angled and shallow. Not the sort of gash one receives from falling forward, but the kind one earns dragging one's hand against rough wood while turning away. Fleeing, maybe, or resisting. She rose as Estelle watched from behind a curtain of orchids, fingers trembling. Gavin Whitmore was dead, but Jessica's instincts whispered that something else had died in this room long ago, and tonight it had come calling. By the following morning, the greenhouse was cordoned off, its glass walls fogged by dew and grief. Jessica stood beside the sheriff once more, watching as the coroner took Gavin's body away. "He's wearing the same suit from the gala," Jessica observed quietly, eyes narrowing. "But his pocket square is missing." Sheriff Mason scratched his chin. "Probably lost in the fall." Jessica stepped closer. "No, something else." She gently reached toward Gavin's inner breast pocket, her fingers moving with respectful care. There, tucked loosely between the lining and the fabric, was a small, crumpled object. She unfolded it slowly. A paper swan. The same fold, the same careful creases. This one, more careworn than the one in the library archive, bore faint traces of moisture as though it had been pressed by a sweating palm. The sheriff looked puzzled. "What's that supposed to be?" Jessica studied it. "A message, perhaps. Or a memory. Someone left it. Or he did himself." Her mind drifted to Sylvie again. The music, the photograph, the swans. Estelle approached, voice hesitant. He'd been, distracted lately. More than usual. That speech last night. He rewrote it 4 times. I found pages in the wastebasket. Jessica asked gently, Was he troubled? Estelle glanced toward the greenhouse, then away. Something was weighing on him, something he couldn't quite say. Jessica nodded, folding the swan carefully and placing it in a handkerchief. There were clues hidden in silence, in what people chose not to explain. In folds, in symbols, in glances toward old glass houses that still remembered music long since silenced. And this one, this paper swan, was not a coincidence. It was the second folded message Jessica had found since returning, and it wouldn't be the last. By midday, the clouds hung low over the Whitmore estate, and a hush had settled into its rooms like dust. The news of Gavin's death had passed from neighbour to neighbour with the fragile speed of candlelight catching lace. Inside, the air felt too still, too watched. Jessica returned to the house and was met not by words, but by glances. Estelle's lowered eyes, the housekeeper's quickly stilled hands, the quiet click of a door shut gently behind her. It was Elspeth Whitmore, however, who struck Jessica most. She was seated in the sunroom, a blanket folded neatly over her knees, her eyes turned not toward the garden, but to something only she could see. Elspeth, Jessica said softly, sitting beside her, I'm terribly sorry. Elspeth did not turn her head. Her voice, when it came, was even but drained. First Sylvie, now Gavin, this house does not keep its children well. Jessica hesitated. Do you believe Gavin's death was an accident? For a moment, Elspeth's fingers clutched the edge of her blanket, then released. I believe, she said, that pain has a long memory. Before Jessica could ask more, the front door creaked open, and Moira Whitmore stepped into the room, boots damp from travel, expression taut. Let me guess, she said to no one in particular. Another Whitmore tragedy, neatly dressed and spoken over. Jessica turned slowly. Moira's tone held not shock, but resentment. And that, Jessica thought, was its own kind of grief. That afternoon, the estate grew quieter still. Jessica stepped out to the grounds, where damp leaves clung to the gravel path, and the garden seemed to sleep uneasily beneath the grey sky. Her thoughts drifted back to the paper swan. 2 now, folded by different hands or perhaps the same. A language of grief. Or guilt. Near the tool shed she spotted Tom Kellam, the estate's long-time gardener, trimming browned hedges with mechanical precision. His face bore the weathered calm of someone long acquainted with death and decay. I'm sorry for your loss, Jessica said gently. Tom didn't look up. Wasn't my place to say much to him, not in years. She studied his expression, a curious absence of surprise. Did you see Gavin yesterday evening? Tom paused, then shook his head. Saw him earlier. Seemed tired, distracted. His answers came too cleanly, she thought. No stammer, no pause to search memory, just prepackaged phrases. Inside the house, Estelle moved about like a whisper, carrying linens, brewing tea, folding things that didn't need folding. Jessica watched her with quiet scrutiny. Are you all right? Jessica asked. Estelle glanced up too quickly. Yes, of course, just keeping busy. Did you hear anything last night, before Gavin was found? Estelle shook her head too quickly. Nothing. I was asleep early. Jessica nodded, her tone warm, but inwardly noted the flicker of panic in the woman's eyes. Both Tom and Estelle bore calm demeanours, but of 2 very different kinds. And Jessica had learned long ago composure could be armour, but it could also be concealment. Later that evening, Jessica sat in the library, the folded swan resting gently beside her notebook. She ran her finger along one of the creases, considering not just its shape, but its silence. Gavin's death had the veneer of misstep, but the deeper she looked, the more deliberate it seemed. The neatly arranged shards, the carefully crumpled swan, the greenhouse chosen not by chance but by meaning. She recalled what Maisie had whispered at the diner, that the Whitmores had never recovered from Sylvie's drowning. And now another tragedy, oddly echoing the first. No, this was not random. It was too curated, too careful. Not an accident. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. The paper swan wasn't a flourish. It was a sentence written in memory's ink. And someone, maybe Gavin, maybe not, had folded it with intention. There was a message here, and she was beginning to read it. Jessica stood at the library window, watching the faint glow of gaslights ripple through the garden. The paper swan lay gently folded beside her. She felt its silence pressing on her, the way old truths sometimes do. She found Moira Whitmore later that evening in the drawing room, seated with a snifter of brandy untouched in her hand. Her posture was impeccable, her jaw tight, the kind of grace one learns under pressure. Jessica entered softly. "You must be exhausted. It's been a difficult day." Moira's eyes, so much like Elspeth's, flicked up. "You're very kind, Mrs. Fletcher, but difficult days are something of a tradition here." Jessica didn't respond immediately. She took the empty chair beside her, allowing the silence to settle first. Then, Maisie mentioned Sylvie. Said the town never quite moved on. Moira gave a dry laugh, the kind that curled at the edges. The town never moved on because no one ever told them the truth. Or maybe they didn't want to hear it. Jessica waited. She was going to leave, Moira said at last, her voice lower. Not just the estate, everything. She had someone, a man my grandmother called inappropriate. A pause, sharp and brittle. And one day, she didn't come back. They said she drowned. But I always wondered if she was pushed, not by hands, but by silence. Jessica studied her. And you resented her. Moira didn't flinch. Of course I did. Sylvie was the sun, and I was expected to orbit her, quietly, obediently. There it was. Not guilt, not quite anger. Something in between. Do you remember his name? Jessica asked softly. Moira looked away. I remember initials, RD, and just like that the swan's message began to unfold. The next morning brought with it a persistent fog and a lingering sense of unfinished thoughts. Jessica rose early, returning once more to the library archives. Her mind circled Moira's words, tracing their edges the way fingers might trace the rim of a long-forgotten teacup. RD, a man Sylvie loved, a man the family erased. Jessica's hands moved with quiet purpose through the shelves, drawn to a leather-bound volume of Chopin's Nocturnes. Not because she expected it to hold answers, but because Sylvie had once played them according to the recital programs. As she opened the book, something inside shifted, a faint crinkle, the soft resistance of folded paper tucked between pages. Her breath caught. Inside the hollowed-out center of the book, barely visible beneath the cover sheet, was a letter, yellowed but intact. Folded into quarters, it bore a single symbol on the back, a hand-drawn swan, delicate, slightly smudged. The same symbolic fold as the ones Jessica had found, but here, captured in ink. She unfolded it with care. Dearest, if this reaches you, know that I still plan to meet you at the orchard just before dusk. I've hidden enough to last us through the journey, and I've spoken to no one but the housemaid. She suspects nothing. The train leaves at 9:10. We'll be free of this place, of all of it. Yours, always, Jessica stared at the signature. No last name, just that single letter, but the looped R matched the swan's curve. She turned the envelope over. Faint pencil marks on the inside flap read, Delancey, Roman Delancey, the music tutor, an outsider, forgotten by design. This wasn't just a love letter, it was an escape plan, and someone had taken great care to ensure it was never mailed. Jessica found Estelle Brandt in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled high, scrubbing an already spotless teacup. The porcelain clinked against the sink, over and over, in rhythm with her breath. Estelle, Jessica began gently, did Gavin ever speak to you about his dreams? The nurse hesitated, then placed the cup down with exaggerated care. He talked in his sleep more than he ever did awake. Always the same fragments. Water, music, someone crying. A name, Sylvie, repeated, like a prayer or a warning. Jessica stepped closer. Did he seem frightened or guilty? Both, Estelle said after a moment, as though he knew something but couldn't quite see it. He'd wake up with tears in his eyes and say, "She slipped. I saw her slip." Jessica's thoughts turned inward. Gavin had been 12 when Sylvie drowned, young enough for memory to blur, but old enough to carry its weight. "I tried to talk to him," Estelle went on, "but he insisted it wasn't real, that it was just a dream. Still, he stopped playing music, wouldn't go near the piano." Jessica nodded slowly. "Did he ever mention someone named Delancey?" Estelle blinked. "Yes, once. He said the name felt familiar but not safe." Jessica's mind worked in gentle layers, the folded swans, the dreams, the forgotten man named Roman Delancey. Gavin had remembered more than he admitted, perhaps more than he understood. But memories don't vanish, they resurface, they fold themselves into dreams, into silence, into shapes that only the heart can interpret. And for Gavin, those shapes had begun to speak. Jessica stepped outside into the soft hush of late morning. The estate grounds, though lovingly tended, seemed to carry their own silence, neatly pruned but stifled, as though too much had been buried just beneath the roots. She found Tom Kellum near the back fence, trimming ivy with slow, deliberate movements. There was something in the way he moved, methodical, almost rehearsed, that made Jessica pause. "Tom," she began, her voice light, "I've been learning more about Sylvie." He didn't look up. "That's so?" "She played Chopin beautifully, they say," Jessica continued, "and it seems she had someone she planned to leave with." This time, Tom lowered his shears. "I was fond of Sylvie," he said at last after a beat. "That wasn't a secret." "Were you the man she planned to run away with?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "No," he said softly, "though I would have gone if she'd asked." Jessica watched him for a moment longer, noting the shadow that passed over his face, not bitterness, but something more painful, regret. "She used to sit here," Tom said, glancing toward the empty bench beneath the oak. "Folded those little swans from whatever she had in her pocket. Sheet music, napkins. It was her way of saying she was still dreaming." Jessica tilted her head. "Do you remember a man named Delancey?" Tom's eyes narrowed. "Roman Delancey, music tutor, out-of-towner, fancy talker. He was the one she loved." "And after she died?" Jessica asked. "He vanished, slipped out like a ghost," Tom murmured. "Took nothing. Left no note. No one ever asked too many questions. Not around here." Jessica's breath caught. A love denied, a disappearance unnoticed, and perhaps not everyone had stayed silent willingly. That afternoon, Jessica sat curled in the library's reading alcove, her notebook balanced on her lap, the letter from Sylvie spread open before her like a whisper finally spoken. The name Delancey echoed now, not in sentiment, but in omission. Someone had carefully written him out of the story. She decided to begin where such people leave faint traces, in institutional records. A few quiet inquiries to the local school board confirmed what Tom had said. Roman Delancey had been hired as a seasonal music tutor nearly 20 years ago, paid by private arrangement, no forwarding address, no resignation notice, just one day, gone. What remained was a short mention in the estate ledger tucked into a dusty file in the Whitmore study, a payment, R. Delancey, June sessions. Nothing after August. That was the month Sylvie drowned. Jessica traced her fingers across the ink, nearly faded, but still legible. She spoke later with the town's retired mail clerk, who remembered Delancey vaguely. Tall, handsome, quiet. Always carried a violin case, seemed nervous that last week, kept checking for letters. Then, nothing. Jessica's thoughts circled. A man in love, waiting for a message that never came, or a man warned away. She couldn't yet be sure, but the pattern was beginning to emerge, not of violence, but of vanishing, fading piece by piece until the story was too faint to follow. And then there were the initials R.D. signed beneath the Swan. Roman hadn't just disappeared, he had been erased, and in that erasure lay the quiet cruelty of Halcyon Hill, to rewrite the narrative without ever admitting it had been changed. Moira found Jessica later that evening in the sitting room, where the fire had settled into embers, and the ticking clock filled the spaces between thoughts. "I need to tell you something," she said, standing rigidly by the mantel. "Not for Gavin, for myself." Jessica set aside her notebook. She waited. Moira crossed the room with the hesitation of someone approaching a wound she had never dared touch. "I found a letter once," she said quietly, "tucked in Sylvie's music book. It was years ago, before she died." Jessica said nothing, only watched as the mask Moira wore began to crack. "I read it," Moira continued. "It was from him, Roman. She planned to run away with him, said she couldn't live under this roof anymore, said she didn't care about the family name." Her hands trembled. "I tore it, burned it. I told myself it was to protect her, but really, it was jealousy. I wanted her to stay. I wanted her to fail." Jessica's voice was soft. "And then she drowned." Moira nodded, her eyes glassy. "And I've lived every day wondering if that letter might have changed something. Maybe she waited too long. Maybe she thought he didn't care." Jessica exhaled. Guilt, folded neatly into time, preserved like paper, delicate and irreversible. "You couldn't have known," she said gently. "No," Moira whispered. "But I still remember the way it smelled, the paper, the ink, the guilt." And there, for the first time, Jessica saw Moira not as bitter, but as broken. Later that night, Jessica returned to her guest room and laid the swans side by side, one aged, the other fresh, both folded with care, both carrying weight. Her mind moved slowly, deliberately. Gavin's dreams, Sylvie's folding habit, Moira's guilt, Roman's disappearance, Tom's guarded affection, Estelle's trembling hands, Elspeth's retreat into silence, all circling the same moment, the night Sylvie died. The swans weren't decoration. They were symbols of something once shared in secret, now echoing back in fragments. Gavin had started folding them after her death. Had he seen something that night? Something he couldn't process then, but couldn't forget? She opened Gavin's childhood journal, kept in the drawer of his room, and found them, crude swan drawings lining the margins, always paired with the letter R, a name, a guilt, a memory pressed so deep it had to be folded to be hidden. Jessica closed the journal softly. The truth, she realized, wasn't buried in the past. It had been folded into the present over and over again, waiting patiently to be unfolded. The following morning was hushed, brittle with the chill that often follows late autumn rain. Jessica descended the narrow servants' staircase at the rear of the house, her hand trailing the worn banister. The corridor below the Whitmore estate was cool and dim, with the scent of dust, lavender polish, and time. She had asked Estelle if she might see the storage areas, purely to satisfy a writer's curiosity. The nurse, preoccupied, had given her a faint nod and handed her the key. The basement was a narrow room with low shelves, boxes stacked in uneven columns, and an old piano stool turned on its side. As Jessica stepped inside, her gaze was drawn to a shelf labelled Sylvie, Personal Music, Library. The spine of one book was worn down to fabric, Etudes Romantiques pour piano. She opened it carefully. A few pages in, folded tightly between brittle sheets of staff paper, she found it, another paper swan, this one yellowed but nearly identical in fold to the others. The page it had been folded from was foreign, German perhaps, likely a music journal. She turned the paper over. There, scrawled faintly on the inside in faded pencil, were the words, Tell no one but the gardener. If I do not return, burn the letter." Jessica's breath caught, but then she noticed something else. A faint drag of a boot through the dust on the stone floor, smudged but recent, not her own. And beside the shelf, a single fingerprint, fresh, pressed into the surface of a book that hadn't been moved in decades. Someone else had been there, recently. Someone who remembered exactly where Sylvie's books were kept, and perhaps what she had meant to do. Jessica returned to the upper floors with the folded Swan tucked into her notebook. The cold clarity of the basement clung to her skin, though the fireplaces in the sitting room crackled warmly. She found Moira standing by the window, arms crossed, eyes fixed not on the view, but on the reflection in the glass. "Jessica," she said without turning, "you're still looking, aren't you?" Jessica offered a gentle nod. Some questions don't fade, they just wait. Moira turned now. Her posture remained stiff, but there was an odd vulnerability behind the sharpness of her tone. "I thought about burning it," she said abruptly. "The will." Jessica's brow lifted. "Will." Moira gave a bitter smile. "Gavin found it, tucked behind one of Sylvie's music scores. She'd had it drawn up with a solicitor in Newbury, signed, witnessed, left everything to Roman Delancey." Jessica blinked. Everything? The estate, the trust, even a piece of the Whitmore Library Foundation. Elspeth never knew. Jessica stepped closer. "Did Gavin intend to make it public?" Moira nodded once. "At the gala, that's what the speech was supposed to be. Not legacy, not literature. The truth." Jessica paused, her thoughts weaving. "Why didn't he?" Moira looked away. "I think he realized what it would do to grandmother, and to me." He hesitated. "But someone must have known he had it." Jessica's gaze narrowed. "Where is the will now?" Moira hesitated, then opened her handbag. She pulled out a manila envelope, creased, unsealed. Inside, a document with Sylvie's signature, dated 6 weeks before her death. Jessica's breath slowed. The signature was real, the witnesses, both local. This wasn't a rumor, it was evidence, and it was a motive. Later that week, with Sheriff Mason's quiet approval, Jessica took a train to Boston, armed with the name Roman Delancey and a suspicion that the past had never truly left Halcyon Hill. Her inquiries began with the New England Conservatory. It took a patient string of questions and a librarian's memory, but eventually a name surfaced: Roman Delancey, now known as Robert Dane, composer in residence at a modest community music school just outside of Cambridge. The man who greeted her was tall, with steel-grey hair, tied loosely at the back, and a cautious kindness in his eyes. When Jessica introduced herself, he stilled, but did not step back. "I've heard of you," he said quietly. "Jessica Fletcher." The writer Jessica offered a small smile. "And you're the man who vanished the summer a young woman drowned." He didn't respond at first, only gestured to a pair of armchairs in his office. "I loved her," he said finally, as he sat. "Sylvie, brilliant, sad-eyed, full of fire but constantly dampened by that house. We were going to leave. The train was scheduled. I waited. She never came." Jessica studied him. "Did you ever learn what happened?" "Only what the papers said. Accident. A fall near the riverbank." His voice cracked faintly. "She wrote me a note, days before. Said if I ever heard a lie told about her, I should write music instead of answering. So I did." Jessica leaned forward. "Did anyone in the family know about your plan?" "I told no one. But she said someone might have suspected. Her brother, maybe." Jessica exhaled. "He found the will. The one leaving everything to you." Delancey blinked. "I never knew. I never wanted it." Jessica believed him, but someone else may have believed otherwise. Jessica returned to the Whitmore estate, well past sundown, her thoughts still echoing with Roman Delancey's soft-spoken sorrow. The ride had been quiet, and she welcomed the solitude of her guest room, the one tucked at the end of the hallway beneath the eaves. She hung her coat and turned toward the writing desk, intent on recording her thoughts before they blurred. But something on the edge of the chair caught her eye, just beneath the cushion. She stilled. There, placed deliberately and without dust, lay a freshly folded paper swan. Smooth, uncreased by time, made from modern sheet music. The same fold, the same silence, but this one hadn't drifted from a forgotten book or slipped from an old letter. Someone had left it for her. She picked it up carefully, her pulse steady but alert. Inside nothing was written. No initials. No message. And yet it said enough. Someone knew she had been asking questions, someone who remembered Sylvie's swans, someone who wanted her to understand this wasn't just a historical mystery. It was alive. Jessica studied the angle of the wings, the care in the fold. This wasn't a threat. Not yet. But it was intimate, familiar, and pointed. She looked toward the hallway, now quiet, every door closed. Not everything in this house wanted the truth uncovered, but the paper in her hand whispered otherwise. The next morning, Jessica found Estelle in the solarium, gently misting the gardenias. Her hands trembled slightly, not with age, but with the effort of restraint. Jessica approached with calm purpose. "Estelle," she said softly, "did Gavin confide anything before the gala?" The nurse paused, eyes lowered. "Only that he was afraid." "Of whom?" "I don't know." Estelle's voice was nearly a whisper. "But he said someone in this house had lied to him, a long time ago, and he finally knew who." Jessica nodded, letting the silence settle between them. "Then?" "He planned to reveal it that night, didn't he?" Estelle hesitated, then answered, "Yes. But I don't think it was just about the will. He had been reading his old journals. I caught him burning pages the day before." "Why?" "He said he didn't want anyone else to carry the guilt, that he would take it with him." Jessica's breath caught. "Do you believe Gavin's death was intentional?" she asked gently. Estelle's eyes met hers, damp with tears. "I don't know, but I think he was ready to be done with the silence." Jessica felt it then, not fear, but a shift. Gavin had reached the end of a story no one else had wanted to read, but he had been planning to speak a name, and someone, perhaps, had listened. That evening, Jessica walked the garden path behind the estate, the stone edge worn smooth by time and weather. The last of the season's blooms clung to their stems, the roses curled inward like secrets too long held. Her thoughts were quiet, but relentless. Gavin's death was not a simple fall. It was layered, crafted, maybe by another's hand or maybe his own. Either way, it had been shaped by memory. The kind that bends the truth slowly until the line between guilt and grief disappears. Jessica considered the swans. Each one folded from silence, each one placed by whom? Not all violence is loud. Sometimes it's passed down like a family heirloom, a wound carefully disguised as tradition. She thought of Elspeth's quiet withdrawal, Moira's brittle strength, Estelle's nervous hands, and Tom's protective grief. Each had something to hide, but not from malice, from memory. And memory, Jessica knew, could be the most dangerous accomplice of all. Jessica returned to her guest room just after dusk, the air inside cool with the first edge of winter. She stood at the writing desk, laying out the folded swans in a neat line, 4 now, each one a silent sentence, in a language almost lost. The original swan, brittle and aged, the one found in Gavin's jacket, damp with sorrow. Another folded in the basement, with Sylvie's penciled plea. And now the newest, placed quietly on her chair. They weren't random. They were deliberate, folded with a particular hand, Sylvie's hand once, and someone else's after her. A quiet code, not of danger, but of truth. Jessica's mind pieced it together. Sylvie had used swans to signal her love, her fear, her escape plan. Only Roman Delancey had understood that language at the time. But someone else had been watching. Someone who had learned to read the message between the folds. And that same someone had folded one for Gavin. Jessica turned to the window. The fog had returned, curling at the garden's edge. The estate's secrets had been pressed flat, folded small, and left in silence. But symbols, like grief, do not stay hidden forever. And someone else, perhaps not Gavin, not Sylvie, was still speaking in that language. Later that evening, Jessica found Moira seated in the drawing room, her shoulders squared but her expression less guarded than before. The house was hushed, holding its breath. Jessica sat down across from her and waited. "You know," Moira began without preamble, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Jessica said nothing, just allowed the air to settle. "I followed her that night," Moira continued. "Sylvie, I had found another letter, a second one after the one I destroyed. I thought if I could confront her, make her see how selfish she was being, leaving us behind, maybe she'd reconsider." Jessica's voice was quiet. "You found her at the river?" Moira nodded, eyes distant. "She was standing on the dock in that green coat she always wore, clutching her suitcase like it was a shield. I said things I regret, cruel things," she shouted back. "She said I had no right to control her life." A pause, then a deep breath. I reached for her arm, just to stop her from turning away, but she jerked back, slipped on the wet boards. I never even touched her. Jessica listened, noting the tremor in Moira's voice. Not just sorrow, but the echo of the moment she'd relived for decades. "I ran," Moira whispered. "Panicked. I didn't even check if she was—" She swallowed. It was raining, and I was so afraid. Gavin must have seen something from the upstairs window. After that he changed, became quieter, obsessed with swans. I hoped he'd forget. Jessica leaned forward. "But memories don't disappear, Moira. They settle." Moira's face crumpled, but no tears came. "I know." And in that quiet confession, Jessica felt the weight of something long submerged rising at last to the surface. Jessica stood later that night at the staircase landing, where a window overlooked the back of the estate, the river barely visible beyond the trees. She imagined a 12-year-old Gavin, too young to understand, too old to forget. The following morning, she asked Estelle if she could see Gavin's room. Estelle hesitated, then silently handed her the key. The room was kept tidy, almost preserved. A few personal effects remained, a bookshelf with old literature, a model boat on the windowsill, and a slim leather-bound journal tucked inside the desk drawer. Jessica opened it carefully. The entries were sparse, written in a tight, uneven hand. The tone changed midway through the book, after a certain date. The week Sylvie died. I saw her fall, I saw the splash. Moira was there, but she cried too. I think she didn't mean it. No one talks about it now. I fold the swans to remember. I dream about the water. Jessica felt a deep ache rise in her chest. The child hadn't blamed his sister. He'd carried the memory silently, confused, unsure, but certain something had gone wrong. And he had folded his grief over and over again. Jessica sat at Gavin's desk for a long while, the journal still open beside her, her eyes drawn to the margins of each page. There, faint and repeated, were small, careful drawings, swans always folded the same way. Some were incomplete, others scribbled out, but they began just after Sylvie's death and continued for weeks. A language he had created not to speak, but to feel. Each swan was a confession Gavin could not voice aloud. He had tried to make sense of what he saw that night. He had questioned, grieved, perhaps even doubted himself. But the memory never faded. It had taken root in the shape of paper, the feel of each fold. Jessica picked up one of the paper swans left in the drawer. It matched the one found in his pocket. Clean edges, crisp lines, no child's hand. She held it carefully. Someone else had begun folding them again recently, and that someone may have known exactly what Gavin remembered. He hadn't left the swan as a decoration. He had left it as punctuation, to a life too burdened by things no one had dared speak. Jessica found Moira in the conservatory, her hands resting on the sill where wilted gardenias pressed against the glass. "Gavin didn't blame you," Jessica said softly. Moira turned, her expression unreadable. "He saw what happened," Jessica continued, "but in his journal he wrote only that you were crying." Moira's voice cracked. "I never knew. He never said." "He said it with swans." Moira looked down. I thought I could protect the family, the name, but all I did was pass the silence along." Jessica stepped closer. "You didn't kill Gavin?" "No," Moira whispered. "But I didn't save him either." Jessica nodded slowly. The house had held its secrets so long, they had become part of the foundation. But with each truth spoken, the walls loosened, just slightly. Enough, perhaps, for the truth to slip through. Jessica found Elspeth Whitmore in the parlour, seated near the cold hearth with her hands clasped in her lap, like porcelain folded into bone. The lines around her mouth were deeper than Jessica remembered, but her eyes, blue, sharp, unfaltering, still held a fierce intelligence beneath the weight of age. "Elspeth," Jessica said softly, easing into the chair beside her, "I believe you've known much more than you let on." The older woman didn't turn her head. "Knowing," she said after a pause, "and acknowledging are two different things." Jessica waited. No rush, no pressure. Elspeth's voice, when it came again, was low but steady. "I knew something broke in Moira the night Sylvie died. I knew Gavin's quiet was not the quiet of peace, but of a child who had seen too much." "Why didn't you ask?" Jessica asked gently. "I did," Elspeth replied, finally turning to her. "Once. Moira said nothing. Gavin said less. And I told myself that silence was survival, that names left unspoken would fade like old ink." Jessica watched her for a moment, the stillness between them filled not with judgment, but history. "You believed you were protecting them," she said. "I believed I was protecting the family," Elspeth corrected. "But I see now. I was only protecting a name." She exhaled, the sound like a door quietly closing. "And names are poor shields against grief." Jessica placed a hand over hers, briefly. Elspeth didn't react, but neither did she pull away. Sometimes guilt grows quietly, like ivy on old stone, clinging even as it crumbles what it was meant to preserve. Elspeth's gaze drifted to the far corner of the room, where a glass box stood on a pedestal. A shadow box containing one of Sylvie's recital programs, yellowed and curling at the edges. Beneath it, folded with deliberate care, rested another paper swan. "I found that in Gavin's room after the funeral," she said. "Didn't understand it. Still don't." Jessica nodded slowly. "He left it as his final note." Elspeth turned her eyes toward her. "A note? With no words?" Jessica unfolded her own handkerchief and gently revealed the swan she had retrieved from Gavin's pocket. The folds were Sylvie's language. She used them to speak without words. Gavin remembered. And when he could no longer carry the silence, he spoke her way. Elspeth's voice was barely audible. "But he didn't leave a confession." "No," Jessica said, "because he wasn't guilty of a crime. He was a boy who saw a tragedy and carried it in silence. And in the end, he wasn't seeking justice. He was trying to understand." She paused. "He left the swan because he couldn't carry the burden anymore." A long stillness passed between them, but it was different now, less suffocating, more like breath finally released. "I should have asked him again," Elspeth murmured. Jessica shook her head gently. He didn't need answers. He needed space to grieve. And perhaps, Jessica thought, so did Elspeth. They sat together in quiet reflection, and for the first time since Jessica's return, the weight in the room felt shared rather than hidden. The greenhouse stood at the edge of the estate's garden, partially cloaked in vines and thyme. Its glass panels were streaked with rain, and the interior, though tidy, bore the faint perfume of gardenias and old soil. Jessica walked the perimeter slowly, her steps soft on the stone path. The place felt less like a sanctuary now and more like a chapel, where memory and mourning met in still air. This had been Sylvie's favourite place, that much everyone agreed on. And this, Jessica now realised, was where Gavin had chosen to end his life. Not by accident, not in haste. He had chosen the greenhouse deliberately. Among the plants Sylvie once tended, surrounded by the scent of the flower she wore in her hair the summer she died. He had come not to escape, but to return. A folded swan in his pocket, a family secret folded into paper, a final moment within memory's glass house. Jessica felt an ache rise in her chest. So many had tried to rewrite the past. Gavin had simply tried to understand it. And when he could not, he came back here, to the one place where Sylvie's voice still lingered in the earth. The day after Gavin's quiet memorial, the house seemed to exhale. Not release, Jessica doubted it ever would, but soften slightly. Estelle, now cleared of suspicion, packed her small suitcase with a kind of hesitant relief. Jessica walked her to the front door. "I wasn't sure what to believe," the nurse said, her voice trembling. "But I always knew something wasn't right." "You protected him," Jessica said kindly. "In the ways you knew how." Estelle nodded once and stepped into the morning, leaving quietly, as she had lived within those walls. Moira, too, was preparing to leave. Jessica found her in the entryway, a single suitcase beside her. Her eyes looked clearer, tired but no longer hiding. "I don't know where I'm going," she admitted. "Only that I can't stay here?" Jessica offered a faint smile. "Sometimes going is part of grieving." Moira paused, then opened her coat pocket. Inside, carefully preserved, was the last swan Gavin had folded. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That afternoon, a package arrived from Boston, addressed to the Whitmore Library. Jessica opened it on behalf of the family. Inside was a hand-bound sheet of music, a new composition, Nocturne for Two Swans, R. Delancey. Jessica read the title aloud. Roman had not returned to the estate, but his music had. It would be performed at the library's winter recital, unannounced, anonymous, but Jessica would know. And perhaps that, too, was a kind of justice. Before leaving Halcyon Hill, Jessica returned once more to the library archives, where her journey had begun. She approached the same table where the first swan had fallen from an old recital program. The dust had been cleaned now, the light clearer. Yet a quiet hush still lingered, as though the room remembered. Jessica slipped a small envelope into the archive drawer. Inside, one of Gavin's final swans, preserved between parchment. Not as evidence, but as history, as memory, as closure. And then she saw it. At the corner of the table, placed with care, was a single gardenia, faded now, its edges curled, its colour dulled to ivory ash. No note, no signature, just the flower. And beside it, resting delicately on the table, the final swan Gavin had left. Fragrance gone, but presence unmistakable. Jessica stood in the stillness for a long moment, and then, with the softest smile, she turned and left the archive. Not every goodbye must be spoken aloud. Some are folded, some are left behind, like flowers without scent, but not without meaning. The river moved slowly this morning, silver-grey, smooth as old silk. Jessica sat on a worn bench near the water's edge, where reeds nodded gently in the early breeze, and the distant church bell gave the hour a sense of gravity. In her lap lay a leather-bound notebook, its spine soft with use. This had once been Sylvie Whitmore's place. Jessica imagined the girl here, decades ago, folding dreams into paper birds, pressing secrets into creased wings, and casting them into a current that promised distance, if not salvation. The water hadn't changed much. Towns do, people certainly do, but rivers carry memory in their slow bends, never forgetting the weight of what's fallen in. Jessica glanced down at her notes. Gavin's swan, the faded gardenia, Moira's confession. There were no loose ends, not anymore. And yet, something about the case still felt tender, like a wound that healed too neatly. It was not guilt she felt, nor triumph. Rather, a quiet melancholy for what time had weathered, warped, and softened. From somewhere across the water, a mourning dove gave its low, tremulous call. Behind her, Cabot Cove was waking up, its shops preparing for the day, its residents tidying porches and watering flower boxes. But here, near the river, time held its breath. Jessica lifted her pen and wrote a line beneath the final paragraph. Sometimes we do not solve a mystery. We remember it, carry it, and in doing so, give it peace. Then she paused, listening, not for sounds, but for silence. For the kind of silence that holds stories without needing to speak them aloud. Truth, Jessica mused, was not unlike the river. It did not rush, it meandered, it waited. Some truths slept beneath the surface for decades, not from cowardice, but from necessity. When Gavin was 12, truth would have shattered him. When Moira was young and frightened, it might have hardened her beyond redemption. And for Elspeth, truth had been a ghost she acknowledged only in candlelight, never in daylight. Jessica remembered something her late husband Frank once said over breakfast. Not everything we bury is meant to stay buried. Some things wait because we're not ready to face them. Perhaps this entire mystery had been less about murder and more about readiness, ready to remember, ready to grieve, ready to speak. She thought of Sylvie and the silence around her death, a silence maintained not by conspirators, but by broken hearts who had simply lacked the language for what happened. It had taken Gavin's final act, not as an accuser, but as a messenger, for the house of Whitmore to finally stir from its long hush. Jessica's eyes wandered across the water again, noting how the sun now filtered through low mist. The clarity came slowly, as always. But it came. In the end, truth didn't arrive in dramatic revelations. It slipped in gently, through the tremble of a voice, the crease of a paper bird, the scent of a long faded flower left quietly behind. She wrote in her notebook, "Silence delays the truth, but it does not erase it." And she knew, some mysteries are only ready to be understood when grief has softened, when love has endured, and when memory stops demanding punishment and simply asks to be held. Guilt is a curious thing, Jessica thought as she looked across the riverbank. It doesn't always arrive with confession or remorse. Often, it lingers in gestures, the too quiet dinner, the missed phone call, the flower never replanted after winter. It had been Moira's guilt, heavy and bruised, that first caught Jessica's attention. But in time, it was clear she hadn't been the only one carrying it. Elspeth, proud and composed, had worn her guilt like heirloom jewelry, visible only to those who knew where to look. A matriarch's burden, she had called it. But Jessica suspected it had become a way to avoid seeing how many voices had gone unheard in that house. Even Estelle, withdrawn and nervous, had been entangled, not by action, but by omission, by the ache of knowing and not naming. The echo of that guilt had perhaps passed through generations, finding its sharpest point in Gavin, the quiet boy who folded paper into meaning because words had betrayed him too early. Jessica leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, and scribbled a line. The shape of guilt is not always a weapon. It is sometimes a shelter. One we build when we cannot face the storm. She looked down at her pen, fingers smudged faintly with ink. The page below her carried traces of that storm, names, events, folded clues, and emotional undercurrents. But the story, at its core, had never been about justice, in a courtroom sense. It had been about memory, and the invisible scars families passed down, not always through violence, but through silence. And what does one do with inherited guilt? Jessica wasn't sure, but perhaps naming it, at last, was a beginning. A glint of white in the reeds drew Jessica's gaze. At first, she thought it was a scrap of paper or perhaps a bit of drifted blossom from a tree upstream. But as she rose and stepped nearer the water's edge, her breath caught. It was a paper swan. Time had softened its creases, and the water had dulled its once bright edges, but it remained, afloat, balanced, persistent, as if it had waited here, drifting between stories and silences, for someone to find it. Jessica crouched, letting her fingers skim the cool surface of the river, but she didn't touch the swan. It seemed wrong to disturb it. Some messages weren't meant to be read, only witnessed. She stared at it for a long while. Was it Gavin's? Had it drifted from the greenhouse, taken by the breeze, or set loose deliberately? Or had it been Sylvie's, folded years ago and forgotten, only to return now, a quiet messenger of memory? Jessica didn't need to know. That was the point. Not every mystery had a neat ribbon tied at the end. Some ended like this, a single fragile thing, weathered by time, yet still afloat. She returned to the bench and opened her notebook once more, writing, "Survival is not always loud. Sometimes it folds itself gently and drifts until someone notices." The swan continued to float. The breeze was rising now, rustling through the tall grass with a hush like breath exhaled. Jessica closed her notebook slowly, the weight of the pages comforting in her hands. In them lived not just the facts of Gavin's death or Sylvie's memory, but something more essential, the cost of silence and the redemptive power of finally speaking. She traced her fingers along the leather cover and thought, not every story ends with justice. Some stories, especially the ones buried in family archives and unspoken grief, end with something gentler, with a truth finally acknowledged, with compassion overriding judgment, with understanding in place of blame. That, she thought, is what healing sometimes looks like. Not a triumph, but a quiet clarity. Jessica stood, taking one final glance at the water, where the paper swan was already drifting out of view, caught in the arms of the slow-moving current. Some truths take decades to surface, but they are patient things. She tucked the notebook under her arm and began walking back toward town. Cabot Cove was stirring again, the distant sounds of a life resuming, bicycles on pavement, bells on bakery doors, someone whistling a tune just out of key. And behind it all, the hum of a mystery concluded, not with answers alone, but with a kind of peace. She didn't need to solve anything else today. For now it was enough to know the swan had been seen. Some endings aren't about solving the mystery, but about understanding the quiet ache it leaves behind, and learning how to live with it. But I wonder, was it truly guilt that kept them silent all these years, or something far more complicated, like love twisted by time? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts or theory in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this quiet unraveling, do give the story a like, share it with someone who loves a gentle mystery, and subscribe for more tales where the truth hides just beneath the surface.